You've probably heard all of this talk recently about the amount of aid that's been going to Ukraine, about whether the US is going to be able to get billions of dollars back for that aid. What's really going on? Well, I'm going to give you a little primer here. Quick guide to all of this stuff, starting with how much money has been given in terms of aid. There's various different categories of aid. So military aid, that's Europe, 62 billion euros. The US slightly further ahead, 64 billion euros of military aid from the US. But of course, that's not the only kind of thing and the only kind of support gone out to Ukraine. There's also other aid. There's humanitarian, there's financial aid. That brings up the European total to about 132, and it's higher than the US, OK? And if you include other things, so the aid that's been promised but hasn't yet been delivered, Europe looks even further ahead. And interestingly, if you look back through the kind of history of this conflict and just how much that aid has crept up, that's European aid, and how much it's crept up since 2022, that's Europe. It's gone up relatively steadily. Look at the US. That's gone up. It was steady for a while. Then it was flatlining, and then when it went up again, what was going on there? It was that when Congress was blocking the new support. So you really see it there kind of visually in terms of the aid that was handed over or wasn't handed over to Ukraine. But kind of back to this, the big picture here, OK? So this includes a lot of different countries. So if we want to get a better sense of comparing different countries and how much they've given, you really need to divide it by every single individual nation. And we can do that here, OK? So this is individual countries, not just Europe as a whole, individual countries. And it's clear the US is comfortably the single biggest donor in cash terms. There you've got the UK down there, and Germany are kind of among the biggest donors, but nowhere near where the US is. But that's the key point, in cash terms. OK, now do it as a percentage of the size of the economy, and it's a different picture. OK, so same data, but as a percentage of GDP. And look, it's different. OK, so the US and the UK about 0.5% of their GDP, which is a better way of comparing it, really. Whereas it's countries like Estonia and Denmark, the Baltics, Finland, Sweden, places like that, which are giving much more of their national income to support Ukraine. And then places like Germany, even further down, because it's got a bigger GDP. So quite striking there. Worth saying, though, to get a bit of a historical context here, let's compare how much aid has been given this time around with previous conflicts. So this is specifically US aid to Ukraine. This time around, that bar is there. It's 0.3 because it's just that's the annual figure rather than for the entire period. This is World War II. So World War II Lend-Lease, far more. US and Korea, far more. Vietnam, far more. Gulf War, far more. Ukraine is tiny in comparison to all of those things. Still, sizable in cash terms, but compared with those, really quite small. And it's not just the US. So take the Gulf War and look at how much different countries paid for the Gulf War in terms of support, particularly for Kuwait. US, Germany, UK, Japan, that's Gulf War, those bars. Now compare it to Ukraine. I'll bring up those bars. So it was smaller, so less money going to support Ukraine this time around than went for the Gulf War from basically all of those major economies. Quite striking, really, isn't it? However, OK, every country can contribute more. Worth just saying, OK? So when it comes to these bars, there's been so much debate recently, particularly from Donald Trump, a bit of a conversation with Emmanuel Macron about this, about how much of this European money was actually a loan. So it's going to come back. And that's what Donald Trump claimed. It's not entirely true. It's about kind of 1/3 true, because some of this money, particularly the financial aid, was structured as a loan. So some of that money theoretically will come back to Europe after a long period. It's a pretty lax loan, but still, it is a loan, whereas that's a grant. And that is why Donald Trump is saying, look, we take that money, we need to get something back. OK, and he says he's done a deal, or at least he's in the process of doing a deal, certainly nothing's been signed yet, with the Ukrainian president, where he thinks that it could be $500 billion back in return for all of that aid given. You're probably wondering at this stage, how on earth do you get $500 billion out of Ukraine? Well, the answer, he says, is rare earths. What are rare earths? They're a type of critical mineral, mostly used in electronics, in military equipment as well. And there are some rare earths deposits in Ukraine. This is a kind of mineral map of the country. If we zoom into this area here, it's in actually the occupied territory, which is, I think, part of the point here. And the Ukrainians were suggesting this. Old Soviet deposit here supposedly has lots of rare earths. The issue, though, but the reason, of course, obviously, Donald Trump wants to do this, is when you look at total rare earth production around the world, and you need rare earths for, like, electric cars, for the magnets in those cars, for all of those wind turbines, it's magnets, it's military equipment. China is massively dominant when it comes to mining rare earths. It's massively dominant when it comes to refining rare earths, which is really the hardest thing to do when it comes to rare earths, because it's really expensive, it's really energy intensive. Totally dominant. So you can see, again, the geopolitical reasons why Donald Trump might want to think Ukraine might solve, kill two birds with one stone here. However, look at the actual data, and it's not altogether obvious that there are many rare earths in Ukraine, even if you take account of that mine, which, like I say, it's been around for a long time. No one's entirely sure if you can get those rare earths out of it. It's still China way in the lead. Brazil, India, Russia, Vietnam, the US. Actually, Ukraine doesn't even show up in the most definitive measures of how much rare earths there are around the world. So some people have wondered, was he not really talking about critical minerals in general? Maybe he was talking not about rare earths, but about lithium, which technically speaking is a different part of the periodic table. Well, if that's the case, yes, there's a big lithium deposit in Ukraine, potentially the biggest in Europe. But here's the thing, Europe doesn't have that much lithium. And compare this with other deposits around the world. I've put it over here. And that, by the way, is a best case scenario. And Ukraine is still a minnow. It's smaller than Canada. It's smaller than the US when it comes to lithium, even bearing that in mind. And so perhaps it just might be, there are lots of minerals in Ukraine, but for the most part, it's the old-fashioned stuff. It's coal, it's iron ore. There's lots of iron ore around there. And it's also things like titanium. And so probably the most plausible explanation is that the president maybe thinks he can make some money out of those things, but I would still question, even bearing all of that in mind, it's going to be very difficult to get to that $500 billion total.